But I think there's one chair too many, actually. Oh, that's why. Yeah, I can. Better now. Yeah, using handwritten because then I remember. Exactly. Yeah. You look like you belong here. You're waiting for me to dance and say if you're not
Is it on? Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to today's plenary session on the inclusive state and theories of public policy and governance. My name is Grace Skogstad, and I have the pleasure of chairing this plenary. As the title of today's third and final plenary indicates, our distinguished panel of speakers this afternoon will address a theme whose significance has already been recognized in the two previous plenaries at this conference. The imperatives of inclusive discourses, knowledge, peoples, and relationships were a major theme among the distinguished panelists in Tuesday's opening plenary on transformative policy futures in the age of the Anthropocene. In her brilliant keynote speech yesterday, Deborah Stone provided a compelling, albeit depressing, account of the pathologies to democracy and inclusive policymaking that are posed by the influence of big money in politics and politicized science, particularly in the case of the United States. Both plenaries, to my mind, demonstrated and drove home the point that inclusive policymaking and governance is key to legitimate and effective policymaking. Today's plenary addresses the theme of the inclusive state directly. We have a very celebrated and distinguished panel of speakers whose research interests have led them to think deeply about what an inclusive state entails and to undertake research that investigates the potential for different mechanisms to help create an inclusive state and inclusive modes of policymaking and governance. It is my pleasure to introduce them very briefly to you, and I will do so in order of their presentations. Sarah Geest is an associate professor of public administration at Leiden University. She specializes in state capacity for innovation, including at the urban level and with respect to sustainability and technology. Her scholarship also investigates the role and implications of big data applications for inclusivity in policymaking and governance. Sarah has published a lengthy list of articles, book chapters, and has a 2021 book entitled The Capacity to Innovate, Cluster Policy and Management in the Biotechnology Sector. Yasmine Abu-Leban is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta, where she holds a Canada Research Chair in the Politics of Citizenship and Human Rights. Yasmine is a leading scholar of Canadian immigration, multiculturalism, and anti-racism policies. She has published widely, including as a co-author of Containing Diversity, Canada and the Politics of Immigration in the 21st Century. Yasmine is a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. She is a past president of the Canadian Political Science Association, and she is currently a vice president of the International Political Science Association. Chris Ansell is a professor in the Charles and Louise Travers Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a prolific author with numerous publications in the fields of public administration, public policy, governance, and organization theory. He is a world-leading author on collaborative modes of governance with a focus on collective problem solving, democracy, and sustainability. He has held numerous visiting professorships, and he has been a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration since 2018. Pia Pong Busabong is an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy at Chiang Mai University in Thailand. His research focuses on policy analysis in the Global South, and he is especially interested in the practical implications of inclusive design attempts at the local level in hierarchical, non-democratic states. Pia Pong is the co-editor of Policy Analysis in Thailand, as well as several journal articles and book chapters. He is also a review editor for the journal Critical Policy Studies. Our distinguished panel today has agreed to the following format. They will provide an opening presentation on their research as it relates to this broad theme of the inclusive state. And in their opening comments, they have also agreed to address one or both of the following questions. How adequately do our existing policy process theories and governance concepts and frameworks explain the rise of the inclusive state and processes to achieve its goals? What insights do theories of public policy and governance have for efforts to create an inclusive state? And the second set of questions, or second question, which is really just one question, is what are the implications of the inclusive state agenda for the methods scholars used to explain public policies and their outcomes? As I mentioned, I will call on the speakers in turn, beginning with Sarah, but before I do that, I want to ask Philippe if he can remind all of you in the audience that you have an opportunity to post questions through the app, and he's just going to remind you about how to do that. These questions will be gathered by the ones online. We will hear those, and then Mia is monitoring the online questions, and she will provide us with those after the speakers have spoken. Do you just want to remind people of the?
So you see, I do everything after I clean the room also. No, it's on your app, you have the button plenary session. You click on this, you log in first, you click on in, and after you have the 3 roundtable and the 3 plenary session. And the last one, you have a button for question, and Mia will receive all your comment and your questions. So you can do during and after. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm messing with your microphone. Okay. Yeah, you ready? Looks good. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for convening this panel, Grace. You probably heard about data, and you're probably a little bit sick about hearing about data. But I do want to talk about data because it's really important, and you'll see why. So when you leave this room, I want to give you 2 takeaways. So in case you leave early or you forgot what I'm saying. So the 2 takeaways that I really want you to think about today is inclusion in sort of our world, which has become a digital world, goes beyond a digital divide and digital skills and digital access. But actually inclusion starts with the data, because they have become the fabric of how we make policies and how we design digital services. As Deborah Stone said yesterday, numbers are a matter of justice. And I really believe the statement is true. And I hope to convince you further today why that is. It is because in the data, people are over and underrepresented. And if we use this data to design services and think about policies, we then also under and overrepresent certain people. The other thing I want to highlight is the research field has sort of split up into public services and sort of more big data, data-driven, evidence-based, evidence-driven, whatever you want to call it. But this divide has also led to the fact that people think the data side of things has nothing to do with the services that are being provided, which couldn't be more not true. Double no. So this idea that there is a link, I'm hoping to convince you that this link is very strong and that we need to think about this link when we look at public services. And just as a note, I'm not saying digital public services, I mean public services in general. So I will try and highlight this throughout the presentation, which is going to be a short one, with giving sort of the expectation that we link to data, and then with the challenges that came with actually thinking about data and public services. So the first one is this idea that data has become very important, and thinking about data is not new. We all know this. So administrative data has always been there, it's always been big, and now we have the technology and the storage to actually use it in a way that we think we see more. And this idea of government, so I work a lot with government, and what they tell me is, well, if we have more data, we see where the gaps are, we see what we're missing. But it's actually very far from what's actually happening. So the thing is, what's happening right now is a lot of resources are being allocated to figuring out where is the data, how can we link the data, how can we analyze the data, and how can we use it for both local and national policymaking. But it also creates pressures to start benchmarking vertically. It means that you have benchmarks for environmental scores, for example. So you start benchmarking. So then as a small city, you invest a lot of resources into benchmarking to these goals, but you forget actually what your city actually needs. What are the indicators that are relevant to your neighborhood, to your city? What we also often forget, even I forget that, when you work with computer scientists, which I do, they have a different logic of thinking about data. What they do is they look at the data and they say, okay, let's look at the data and figure out the patterns that are emerging from the data. Whereas we as social scientists, we say we need a question first. We need to ask the question and ask the question to the data and figure out what's happening. And this is a big divide that you also see in the IT departments and data departments within government, right? So you have the data people, and then you have usually social scientists who are then policymakers or consultants to policymakers. So this is something we need to remind ourselves when we think about sort of data-driven policymaking. I'll give you an example. So I had a project with a Dutch city, because I work in the Netherlands, and they have this, they call it a poverty pass. It's a terrible name. So it's a pass that gives you access to theaters, swimming pools, sports at a reduced price or for free. So you tap the pass and they know who has the pass. So in principle, they have a lot of data about the pass. So they said, okay, let's see what people are doing. Where are they tapping? And then they came to us and they said, no one is using the pass. And we don't know why, because the data doesn't tell us. We only see if it's being used. So then I said, okay, does the pass cover public transport? No. Okay, that's a problem, because that means people have the pass, but they don't have money, so they can't get to the activity they actually want to attend. The other thing was, I asked them, like, do you have to show your pass when you go somewhere? Like, does it need to be visible? Yes, because you're not tapping it somewhere. And I said, what about shame? Maybe people don't want to show the pass. Also something they hadn't thought about. So you can have all the data about this pass, but if you forget the human who's using the pass and you forget about the potential infrastructure they need to tap into, the data doesn't give you anything. And it also doesn't show you the gaps or what you're missing. The other thing is this idea of digital by default, and you've probably heard it, right? So this idea of 24/7 services by government. We sit on our couch, we order the new passport. Well, maybe not if you're German. I'm German, so you don't do that when you're German. But otherwise, usually people can do that online, right? And in this sort of move towards digital by default, we see that we also talk about these digital skills, the digital divide, digital access. But actually, what we need to think about is the offline structure that supports the access to public services. So there's a really good paper by Linus et al. Who talk about this. So what they did is they gave people options of sending an email for a service, a phone number, a postcard, and a postcard with a stamp. And the expectation was, well, probably elderly people will call, and then the others will probably email. Most people that were sort of defined as a vulnerable group used the postcard, even the postcard without the stamp. And then you would say, why would they go to such length of going to a mailbox and putting in a postcard or even getting a stamp? It's because these are people who have difficulty with language. So they don't know how to address a bureaucrat in a formal way. They don't want to send an email. They don't want to have someone on the phone asking a question that they cannot answer immediately. They know how to get a stamp. They know where the mailbox is on their street. So they choose sort of a safe way to communicate. And then you say, okay, fine, we have to keep those channels open. But the reality actually is, at least in the Netherlands, these channels are being closed. So the phone number is becoming a very generic phone number. The email address doesn't exist. So here's the digital form, please fill it out. The other thing that we see is that people are scared to fill in something wrong, right? So they have a digital form and then they sit there and they're afraid that if they fill in something wrong, they will not get the benefits that they need for food, for clothes, whatever that might be. So this is a very important component that is outside of the online world, is actually part of the offline world. And it's something to remember, I think. The other thing is, and this is sort of the favorite thing I always get upset about, it's prediction, right? So when you think of all these machine learning AI models that we talk about, usually they're focused on fraud detection. So that's their goal, right? So fraud detection, who's defrauding the system? How can we predict crime? This is sort of the main purpose usually when they're put in place. This is also where the role, I think, that were still mentioned yesterday, where the role of private stakeholders actually comes in, because the government often can do it by themselves. So the models come from private companies, and the consultancy in using these models also comes from private companies. And we had a meeting with a private consulting company, a big one, I don't need to tell you the name. And they said, okay, we got this great traffic light system for people who are about to defraud the welfare system. I was like, okay, that already sounds suspicious, but okay, go ahead. And then they said, it's red, yellow, green. And if you're red, they sort of get in touch with you. You need to provide additional documentation. And I said, okay, based on what factors am I in the red category? And then he said, yeah, we're not really sure because it's a self-learning machine algorithm. But the main factor is actually when you don't show up to the meeting. I'm like, okay, did you think about this? So you're getting a letter in a language you potentially don't understand to show up to a meeting as, let's say you're a single parent with 3 kids. So you're supposed to show up to the meeting. And if you don't, immediately your status becomes red. And then they tell you, not only are we withholding the benefits, now you also need to provide additional documentation to prove that you're not defrauding the system. So this was the AI application that was being sold to government. Not a good look at all. But this is also, so in this category also falls overrepresentation. So when you think of cameras and you think of crime, if people live in certain neighborhoods, they're being over surveilled. That also means there's a lot more data on them, right? So if you jaywalk in the neighborhood you live in, probably no one will know. No one cares. But if you live in other neighborhoods where there's a lot of police presence, where there's cameras, people might stop you, might get a point, because that's how predictive policing works. You get points. And if you have too many points, it changes sort of how certain data is tracked on you. So this is this idea of sort of under and over representation that comes on top of that. So there's good news. So this was all bad news. I'm trying to go to the good news because Grace asked us to also give sort of perspective. So there has been a turn towards the citizen. So government realized we're actually further removed from the citizen with this whole data digital things, which is an issue, as I try to show through the examples. So there has been a turn towards thinking about the citizen first from the perspective of the citizens. So there's the administrative burden concept. It's one of many, but it's one of the ones where they think about sort of the psychological costs, the learning and compliance costs that you have when you sort of step forward and try to use a public service. There's also people who think about how people actually engage. So there was this project where my colleague told someone, well, you're not actually engaging. Like, how are you participating in democracy? And he said, I am engaging, but I'm engaging with my neighbors. I'm engaging very locally. It's something you cannot see, but I'm very active in my community, right? So this idea of people are not online or they're not engaging visibly, they're not engaging in sort of society. And I will come back to that, why that might be an issue. And also there's literature that has actually been around for quite a while, which is questioning the metrics that we use to measure certain things and how we categorize people in the systems that we use that then feed into the algorithms or the data-driven policymaking, whatever you want to call it. Also in terms of the statistical offices. So we sometimes forget those offices, but those are the ones who have all the administrative data or a lot of administrative data. And then this idea that you can use social media, for example, to sort of fill the gap, the data gaps that they have, which is a very dangerous way to go because social media is not representative. But there has been a turn to thinking about the citizens and thinking about sort of the data system that supports citizens in this context. So I want to leave you with this table. It focuses on services. Why am I leaving you with this? Because it starts getting into a very relevant question, I think. And this is the question, who's responsible? So if we're missing a data point, or if someone is unwilling to leave their house and not use digital services and not engage, who's responsible to take care of this person? And I've asked this question actually to a couple of people, especially people from government. And it's very interesting. So a lot of government people, at least in the Netherlands, tell me, well, it's a citizen. They have to sort of engage. And this is where I sort of stopped and thought, okay, that's very interesting. And I think this sort of table is a first attempt to figure out, okay, what do we have? So we have people who are independent. They're trying to figure out themselves. That's fine. They have people who have a network around them, neighbors, kids, parents, whatever it might be, that help them. And then we have formal help seekers. So those are who show up at the city hall, who call the hotline. The formal help seekers are the easiest one to address because they're out there, they're seeking for help publicly. But what about the other two categories? So what we see is that there's organizations moving into that space that try to sort of engage these people and try to help them with services, whatever that might be. And again, I'm not saying digital services, I'm saying services in general. But I'm giving you one sort of example again, that's kind of depressive. But so there was this idea of service points in the Netherlands where they said people can come and get a service. And it was located in libraries because they thought the infrastructure of libraries is already there. This sounds very convincing. But if you're a middle-aged man who did manual labor all their life and you have a trouble reading Dutch or the language where you are, you will not go to a library. You've probably never been to a library. Whereas if you're a migrant woman who has kids, who wants to expose them to books, you've been to the library. So when we think of vulnerable groups in the setting, we also need to rethink who we're thinking about. So it's not the standard category. It's actually very complex who we're addressing and how we're addressing them. So I'm going to leave you with the question, who's responsible in engaging in sort of this more data and digital world? Thank you so much.
Well, I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging that we're in Toronto, which is in the dish with one spoon territory, which called for a sharing of land and a stewardship of land in a spirit of mutual cooperation. And I share this land acknowledgement because in addition to reconciliation in Canada, it is a reminder that well before there was a Canadian state, there were ideas that were compelling and inclusive of both humans and non-humans. So I'd like to thank Grace and the organizers for this kind invitation to participate in this roundtable on the inclusive state. I attended the very first international conference on public policy in France in 2013. And it's really great to see how this conference has in a decade become a real institution. And one of the things I really like about the ICPP conferences is the opportunity to consider contemporary trends. And in this regard, the topic of the inclusive state is really compelling. And this is because the discourse around the inclusive state is to be found today in many places, from governments to NGOs, and of course in academic scholarship. So in the time that I have, I will argue that while there is much that is valuable in the idea of the inclusive state as a concept and in the agenda associated with it, there are also some drawbacks in terms of grappling with some of the more critical perspectives on the state. These more critical perspectives on the state are made evident when we consider settler colonial states from the vantage point of Indigenous populations. And it also comes out when we consider people who migrate, that is, move across or attempt to move across state borders, because here we see how migration policy is tied to exclusion. So to make this argument, I'm going to proceed in three parts. First, I'll consider the idea of the inclusive state as a concept and why it might be emerging more forcefully now. Second, I will think about the kind of agenda for research and public policy that the inclusive state might entail and what is compelling about that. And then finally, I'll turn to considering some ways that the inclusive state may potentially silence certain critical perspectives on the state that concern precisely how the very structure has and continues to lend itself to exclusion as well as dispossession and violence. And for this last part, since we're gathered in Toronto, I want to share some of my work concerning Canada as a settler colonial state that continues to receive certain immigrants. So let me turn to the first part of my talk, which is the concept of the inclusive state. So it's very interesting that in recent years, we're seeing greater emphasis on this idea of the inclusive state. So for example, as far back as 2008, the World Bank published an edited book by Anis Dani and Arjun Dahan arguing that reaching the Millennium Goals required inclusive states. And here they argued that in inclusive states, citizens, quote, have a say in the decisions about which services are provided, how those services are delivered, and where they can exercise democratic rights. More recently, in a 2022 article in American Political Science Review, Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson understand an inclusive state as being one which contrasts with weak states or despotic states, and where the impact of civil society forces are stronger and more evenly matched with elites that accumulate state capacity and power. So as they put it, society can fight back in an inclusive state. Here in Canada, Justin Trudeau has been very vocal in his support of feminism and women's empowerment in Canada and internationally. And the Canadian government explicitly states that they're committed to inclusive governance at home and abroad, arguing governance is inclusive when it effectively serves and engages all people. And then a recent intervention comes from Guy Peters, who was writing at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the contradictions that were emerging, which in many jurisdictions created changes in policy quite quickly, and a lot of speculation about what kinds of other changes might be possible. And so Guy Peters defines the inclusive state as a system of governance that will involve larger portions of society and public life and include more of the public in the benefits created by the economic system, as well as deal with the problems of social exclusion and discrimination. I like Guy Peters' definition for its comprehensiveness. But generally, I think if you look across these definitions, the common denominator of the kinds of things that are being discussed in the inclusive state is that there is an idea of governance, meaning something broader than just what governments do, and somehow connecting more with society or groups in society and dealing with social issues and policies. And the inclusive state is an attractive and compelling concept, especially in the current context, where both globally and locally, we see growing gaps between the rich and poor and the ongoing fallout from neoliberal policies since the 1990s. In fact, Wendy Brown's recent book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, stresses the importance of understanding the really radical manner in which now 3 decades of neoliberal governance has impacted law, political culture, and even political subjectivity, with dramatic negative consequences for democracy and gains by the hard right in many countries around the world. And so one might say the inclusive state is an idea that in some ways is a response from the ruins of neoliberalism, where all sorts of social issues and inequities have become increasingly complex and glaring. You've been in Toronto for the last few days, but across Canadian cities right now, there's a serious crisis in affordable housing that's been aggravated by the pandemic. So let me continue on this theme and turn to the second part of my discussion to briefly consider the research and policy agenda that is potentiated by thinking about the inclusive state, because I think there is something energizing here. I agree with Guy Peters when he says that's really one of the more interesting ideas for reform. And that's precisely because it brings society in, or to turn a phrase, brings society back in. You know, consider here that Margaret Thatcher once said there's no such thing as society, meaning people have to help themselves. But the inclusive state says there is society. It says different groups in civil society should have a voice, and also the outcomes would be better if they did. It's also not new public management, even new public management, second generation iteration of emphasizing partnerships. So I think it opens up the imagination to how we might consider policymaking. And it's liberating to think of many areas of contemporary public policy that might be better improved if more stakeholders were brought in. I'm sure Chris Ansell may be talking about it, but this idea of co-creation also gets at that. So for instance, in the Canadian context, Michael Orsini, who does work on disability, was recently speaking about how few people with disabilities were actually engaged directly in the making of policy. And this is despite nods by the federal government to the idea of inclusive governance. And we could imagine how in all sorts of policy areas, the policies might potentially look different if those directly impacted by policy actually had a seat at a table and a voice, whether we're talking about refugee policy, housing policy, childcare policy, and the list could go on. In terms of policy research, the inclusive state agenda could change some of the methods analysts use to address policy, because it would become more important to think about social forces, specific experiences, ideas in civil society, and even could prompt community engaged research in relation to policy. I also think that the discourse of inclusion can lead to more comprehensive and intersectional ways of looking at individual policies or several policies. So just as an example, there's an index created by the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley that measures inclusiveness. This index began in 2016, and it ranks countries worldwide and US states on a bunch of indicators. So they look at things like race and religion and gender and sexual orientation, disability. And alongside that, they look at issues of political representation, income inequality, anti-discrimination laws, rates of incarceration, and immigration and asylum policies. It's more holistic than considering just one dimension like gender, and it essentially gives value to the multiple identities people hold in any given society. So in this index, countries that have policies that are hostile to immigration, limit women's reproductive rights, and limit queer rights tend to fall on the less inclusive side. But the point is, I think, that if more voices from civil society were heard, the result would likely be more intersectional approaches and perhaps more targeted or customized policies, likely better policy. Finally, let me turn to thinking a little more closely about Canada and offer some caution about what may be silenced in the discourse of the inclusive state. So what you're viewing right now is a 2017 painting by Cree artist Kent Monkman entitled The Scream. It depicts the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, part of the Canadian state, along with priests and nuns, literally ripping Indigenous children from the arms of their parents to send them to residential schools in the name of assimilation. These schools operated formally from the 19th century. And by the way, the last residential school did not close until the 1990s. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada reported on the manifold abuses of residential schools, calling it cultural genocide, a finding accepted by the Government of Canada. In the years since then, there have been unmarked graves of hundreds of children found on the grounds of residential schools by ground penetrating radar. The Canadian government has apologized and formally committed to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, although still not all of these calls have been met. And it's unclear the extent to which they can be in the absence of dealing with what Indigenous scholar Joyce Green calls that little matter of land theft. And so this brings me to features we see in settler colonies, of which Canada is but one of many theorized examples, which also includes the US, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Palestine, the list can go on. As Isabel Altamirano Jimenez notes, settler colonialism can be understood as a specific colonial formation characterized by its relation to land and resources, with many accounts addressing the remaking of Indigenous land into the settler home. The language of the inclusive state can't really deal with the settler colonial state in the way it is understood by feminist, Indigenous, and other scholars engaged in settler colonial studies. Their work stresses these kinds of points. One, that settler colonialism is an ongoing process in the here and now. So in the words of Patrick Wolf, it's a process, not an event. So we need to recognize the colonial present. Two, settler colonies are about control. Settler colonial studies draws attention to how settler states exercise control over lands and people, particularly Indigenous peoples, in the name of frontier expansion and managing diversity. Three, social relations are complex. Feminist intersectional theorists have observed that settler colonies are incredibly complex when it comes to gender, race, ethnicity, class, amongst other lines of difference. So these may feed what is sometimes called wicked problems in the policy literature. Four, resources, land, and Indigenous resistance are also relevant because in settler colonies, there's ongoing Indigenous resistance to the usurpation and exploitation of land and resources by state and or by industry, usually with bad environmental consequences, as we heard from Deborah McGregor in the first roundtable of this conference this year. And then finally, violence. Settler colonies are places formed through violence. Literally, massacres and genocide can be read in the histories of settler colonies like Australia, the US, and Canada. And moreover, violence is ongoing today. Indigenous peoples continue to experience violence, whether by the state with police violence and incarceration, or in the larger civil society. So given the ongoing nature of settler colonialism and the issues it raises around violence, land, resources, and power, the inclusive state may be seen as diverting attention from how the state itself is part of a structured pattern of oppression. The inclusive state also doesn't really address policies that are designed primarily to exclude. So Grace mentioned my book with Ethel Tungo and Christina Gabriel on Canadian immigration policy that just came out in 2023 with University of Toronto Press. It examines Canada's changing immigration policy from 9/11 through the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not going to go into details about this book, though I'm happy to speak to it later, but rather I'm just going to make a very simple point, which is that the very purpose of migration policy is to exclude, because the states didn't want to regulate and control the movement of people, we'd have open borders. In the case of Canada, immigration policy was used historically to build Canada as a white settler colony through race-based exclusions. And today it's used to get the kind of citizens Canada wants, which are those with skills, and to keep out most others. So to conclude, in my assessment, there are lots of benefits to thinking about and envisioning the inclusive state, but there's a risk to only talking and thinking about the inclusive state. And this is because some policies can be exclusionary by definition, and the historic formation of states as settler colonies complicates the very idea of inclusion. Indeed, Indigenous peoples are generally not seeking or calling for inclusion in the state, but rather autonomy from the state and to regain their own forms of governance and sovereignty. Such dimensions can get masked in a discourse on inclusion that does not recognize that even the states formally committed to inclusionary governance, like Canada, may be Janus-based and have sharply contrasting characteristics that impact different groups differentially. So to end by talking about the state as Janus-based rather than only inclusionary may seem pessimistic, but actually it's not, and I'm not. In my view, recognizing contradictions may be beneficial to more creatively and robustly pushing alternative, more emancipatory visions that might be advanced through the stress placed on society and stakeholders in the inclusive state concept and agenda. Thank you.
All right. So hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. It's too close, not far close enough. Okay. It's been another great ICPP conference. I'm looking at Philippe. And thanks to Grace and the whole team for all your hard work. My first reaction when Grace invited me to sit on this roundtable was, what do I know about the inclusive state? Many of you may have that kind of reaction when you're invited to be on a roundtable. But then I have reflected a little bit more maturely, and I began thinking about all the ways that I think actually my work does touch on the topic of inclusion. For the last 15 years or so, I've been thinking a lot about the possibilities and limitations of collaborative governance. And the latest iteration of that work is research with Eva Sorensen and Jakob Torfing on co-creation, which we see as a mode of collaborative governance that's used for purposes of social innovation. And my book on the right, I think it's on the right here, yeah, the book on the right, which comes out in October, comes to the conclusion that we need to think more about the possibilities for what the sociologist of development, Peter Evans, called state-society synergy. Most recently, I've been working on sustainable agriculture, and I've been working on cases of ranching and wine growing in California and coffee sustainability in Vietnam. And I recently returned from Vietnam, where I was studying something called the Production, Protection, and Inclusion Compact, or the PPI Compact for short. And the issue in all three of these cases is really how to include farmers in efforts to make farming more sustainable. And so I want to try to draw a few implications about the idea of the inclusive state from this body of research. And I want to start by reflecting on two different meanings of the inclusive state, that at least in terms of how I thought about it. And the first is about empowering those who are disadvantaged and marginalized. And the other meaning of inclusion is about engaging all citizens more directly in the process of governing. And I think already on the panel, we've heard a mix of both views. And the first point I want to make is that although these two meanings are different, and I think they have different political imperatives in some ways, I think it's often very important to consider them together. And my view is that collaborative governance has a lot of potential to foster a more inclusive state, both for citizens in general and for more disadvantaged and marginalized citizens. But a challenge we often see in collaborative governance is that attempts to include civil society in governing can unintentionally or even unintentionally reproduce or even accentuate inequities in participation. So we need to guard against that. And we need to be vigilant about how collaborative governance is designed and led. A second lesson I wanted to draw from my research is that an inclusive state has to meet people where they are, or in this case, where they sit. This is a coffee farmer we interviewed who was participating in the PPI Compact. And I was really impressed by the importance that the compact placed on making trips out to visit farmers on their farms. And I think that's important in at least three ways. First, inclusion is enhanced by engaging citizens, engaging people around issues and problems that they directly experience. Second, real inclusion is not just about creating forums that farmers can participate in. Those often don't work very well for farmers, I've found. It's also about outreach. And that means visiting farmers on their farms. And the third point is that the motivation for farmers to participate often depends on being able to deliver customized solutions, which in the case of coffee sustainability means developing customized sustainability strategies for individual farms. Inclusion also means understanding the people you're trying to include. In Vietnam, a lot of poor coffee farmers in the region we visited are like this family here from an ethnic minority called the Caho people. And our interviewees told us that working with minority farmers was challenging, in part because of really high rates of literacy in that community. But if they didn't or couldn't participate, on the other hand, these farmers can lose out on the opportunity to sell their coffee at higher prices. To sell it at higher prices, you have to have sustainably produced coffee. So working with ethnic minority farmers is an explicit objective and a priority of this PPI Compact. And so we asked the leaders of the compact, what did they do to include these farmers in their program? And we gleaned a couple of different strategies. First, the PPI Compact had learned that before visiting individual farmers, they needed to work through the customary governing structures of the Caho people. And second, they also learned that it was important to work with the Caho people in their own language, and also to invest time in socializing with them, because that's what helped to build trust with the program. And third, they developed a strategy of showing rather than telling. For example, taking Caho farmers to demonstration farms and showing them how the practices, sustainability practice, could actually increase their income and also protect the environment. The next lesson I draw from the collaborative governance literature is that democratic and problem-solving aspirations for collaboration often get kind of complexly tangled up in practice. And in some cases, they can pull in very different directions with important implications for inclusion. On the democratic side, collaboration is often seen as enhancing representation and enhancing citizen voice. But collaborative governance also tries to bring stakeholders together to solve particular problems. And it often talks about convening the relevant and affected actors. That phrase, relevant and affected actors, is meant to be broadly inclusive, but there's often pressure in practice to strategically limit the number of stakeholders who are actually part of the collaboration. So doing so, strategically limiting the numbers, can reduce transaction costs, and it can increase the likelihood of reaching agreements, but it can also limit the representation and voice of citizens. So my last lesson draws on some joint research I did on collaborative inclusion directly. So I actually have worked on inclusion. We started out by building on existing research and kind of surveying what's already been talked about. And then we developed what we call the synthetic model. It was partly geared towards the kind of data we had to test it. But anyway, we put this synthetic model together, and that's what you see shown here schematically. And I'm not going to talk about all the details here. That would take me a long time, but I'm going to just point out make a few points draw out a few key points about it. And first of all, collaboration can be costly for those who might want to participate. And it's often unclear to participants what can be gained through participation. And I think this is really true for all potential participants, but the barriers can be even higher for disadvantaged and marginalized citizens. So a key point I learned from this joint research is that if you're serious about inclusion, you have to take active steps to make it attractive for people to participate. A number of scholars have argued for the importance of what they call inclusion management, which tries to do just that. Participants feel more motivated to participate if they feel welcomed, empowered to speak, they believe their efforts are worthwhile, they think they're going to make a difference, which depends in turn on what this literature on inclusion management calls relationship building and informational work. So this is part of the process of making collaborative inclusion work. In general, research on inclusion management emphasizes that effective inclusion requires active citizenship to include people in collaboration. So you have to have leadership to do this. Okay, now let me turn to I'm going to kind of end there my stuff and then turn to the broader questions that you asked. And here's the first one up here that we were asked. And a first general point I want to make, which I think fits nicely with Yasmine's point, is that if we're going to think about inclusion, we really need to think about exclusion too, along with it. I think they tend to point to different kinds of political and institutional mechanisms operating, but they're really two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. So keeping this in mind, my general answer to this question is that the ambition of public policy theories has primarily been to explain policy change. It's not been to explain inclusion or exclusion per se. But since policy affects who gets what, when, and how, I think policy process theories already provide a lot of intellectual resources for thinking about inclusion and exclusion. But the real question, I think, is whether we're really using these intellectual resources to address those issues. So that's a little bit different point. I also try to think about bodies of theory that really directly address the question of an inclusion and exclusion. I had a little bit of a hard time, but I came up with 3 of them, which betray my background in public administration, I think. So the first one is representative bureaucracy theory. When I read this literature, I find that it's really complicated to kind of make a really clear judgment about what's happening. But on the other hand, I think it really opens up a lot of important ideas about what inclusion means and how it might work. And the second perspective I thought about is research on street-level bureaucrats and their role as de facto policymakers. I don't think I would really describe this research as directly about the issue of inclusion and exclusion, but I think it provides a lot of insights about how citizens receive or don't receive certain state benefits. And the third point, the third body of theory that I think is very relevant, and this was also mentioned by Sarah, is relatively recent literature. Probably it has old roots, but I think it's relatively recent since I've encountered it. It's about administrative burdens, which means procedures that have been used to limit access to state services. And the argument is typically that these burdens are a kind of politics by other means. What I like about all 3 of these bodies of literature is I think that they try to specify the institutional mechanisms that produce differential outcomes for citizens. And this leads me to the second question posed to us, which is about the methods we should use to study the inclusive state. And I basically, as a methods person, I'm basically ecumenical about methods. And my gut reaction to this question is that we should try to use any and all methods that offer any bit of insight. But I suppose the spirit of the question is really about whether there are any specific empirical challenges to thinking about inclusion and exclusion. And one thing occurred to me. Oops, I went too far, but okay. One thing that occurred to me is that while processes of inclusion are often public and transparent, processes of exclusion are often hidden and non-transparent, which makes them quite challenging to identify and confirm. So that made me reflect on how we do that. And this isn't very profound, but it's just kind of my way of starting to think about it. So the first way we think about observing hidden processes of exclusion is we directly witness them. And that means being able to maybe directly observe or conduct experiments on them. And I think we can do that, but that's pretty challenging. So the second strategy is that I think we can be informed about those exclusionary processes, and we can learn about them. We can be informed about them by surveys and interviews. But of course, that tends to raise issues about the reliability of the informants. And third, we can infer exclusionary processes through aggregate data on decisions and actions. But that raises frequently raises concerns about causal identification. So again, from my ecumenical point of view, my view is that all these approaches have their strengths and drawbacks. And our best empirical strategy is generally going to be to triangulate between them. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Grace, and thanks IPPA for inviting me here. I'm very pleased to be here and share with you. I gonna simply share what we have done so far with my team. Some of them actually here, Aura is over there, Pop Suk is over there. So our team from the School of Public Policy, Chiang Mai University, we perceive ourselves as the academics in the sense that we not just work in the academic world, but we also engage with the local governments and national government as well to work together in order to make change as much as we can do. So what I'm gonna share today is the attempt of our team to build the inclusive state from below. I'm gonna quote the term attempt or the intention, which the recognition that it's not really easy to transform the country that we are living in to be the inclusive state, but at least we can do something to make the pathway toward it. So I just need to start with the thing that I think is very important to talking about, which is the photo that you all see from the screen right now. We invite the person struggling with homelessness in the forum, and you're gonna see that he expressed his hope and his fears in front of the policymakers, the civil servants, and other stakeholders of the city. And we ask all the policymakers, civil servants, and stakeholders to just there, listen to them, and thinking about how they're gonna address his hopes and his fears. This is what we try to do. I'm gonna unpack the detail of what we're doing together so far. Just want you to see that this is something that different from the conventional planning practices that our government conduct so far. Okay, so it's very important to point out the underpin policy theoretical thoughts that help us frame our practices. I think it's very important to start with critical policy approaches. For the previous 2 days, the editorial team of the Critical Policy Study Journal discussed very much what exactly meant by critical in policy studies. At least one thing that I would say is quite clear, that when we're talking about critical policy study, it means we need to recognize the disadvantaged people, the vulnerable people, the oppressed. We need to see the unseen. We need to count the uncounted people. And this is the standing point of critical orientation of policy studies. Under the umbrella of critical policy studies, we also frame our work based on the interpretive policy inquiry, which bring us to the epistemological question, what exactly should be counted as the policy knowledge? And if we come back to the discussion yesterday by Deborah, I'm very pleased that she also here as well. We're going to see that actually we can count not only the logical narratives, we can also need to count the normative narratives. And of course, the emotional narratives. It means that when we're talking about the mode of rationality, it should not limited to logical one or instrumental rationality, but we need to recognize other rationality as well. And with that, it's very important to thinking about here the unheard. Make sure that nothing lost in translation. As the policy analyst, as the policy practitioner, we need to be the policy translator as well, to translate the meanings, different meaning from the logical, normative, ideological to emotional. And this is what we put into our mind before we organize, before we decide what we have done with the project that I'm gonna share with all of you. And the last one, of course, thing could not happen without deliberative space that we need to create. And with deliberative policy analysis in particular, it's very important to start with the design. It doesn't mean that we can assume automatically that people gonna be heard, their voice gonna be louder enough for policymaker to accept or to perceive that voice without the design of proper deliberative platforms. And also the role of ourselves, Aura over there, Popsuk over there, and me as the deliberative policy analyst, we need to play the role. Very important one is to be the facilitator, to mediate the conflicts, especially the value conflicts, to thinking about how to translate all the meanings, as I already mentioned, and to be the critical friends, especially in the context that need it the most. I mean, the global south in general as well. But of course, to do the deliberative policy analysis in that context, in Thailand, of course, I talking about the place that we are gonna share with you about what we have done there. We need to recognize from the beginning that there are highly social inequalities, of course, and also very strong social hierarchy there. So we cannot just simply thinking about deliberative protocol from the West. We need to thinking about empower deliberation in the sense that we need to make sure that the disadvantaged, their voice gonna be heard from the design of deliberative process. Okay, so this is the underpin policy theoretical thoughts for the practices that we put in mind. Then I'm gonna share the specific activity that we have done. The first thing is to create the inclusive space. A lot of platform that we open for everyone to be able to come to share their feeling. We think it's very important to thinking about emotional engagement in the sense that it doesn't mean that people need to come and use their technical knowledge to identify problem at hand. Some people can do, but some people cannot. But if you want to include people, we perceive inclusiveness more than just inclusive include the people, but we're thinking about include their hope and their fears. And everyone could hope, everybody could fear. And that's very important for us to shift the narrative from problem at hand, which people might be able to identify, but some people may not. But everyone can share that in their hopes, their fears. And that is the point. It's a part of the inclusive process. We not only identify the common hopes and common fears, we also interview to make sure that we're gonna harness hopes and fears of the most advantaged group in Chiang Mai. And with that, we've developed the personas. What does it mean by persona? It means that we capture the journey maps of those people and put that into the one page. We use this as the beginning, as the input for the empower deliberation, which is the next, I don't want to say stage, the next jigsaw in the work that we have done. To capture the different hopes and fear, I would like to address a little bit here that we use the causal layer analysis to unpack both the observable, the structural, the discursive, and the inner or psychological hopes and fears, for us to make sure that we not simply put hopes and fear, just only the one that we can observe. So this is very helpful to use the iceberg as the metaphor to thinking about what we can observe and what we cannot. And of course, in terms of deliberative design, I think participatory design groups very useful, not only for us, but I think a lot of you who engage in the deliberative literature might also familiar with. It's very important to point this out. We shift or we switch from public hearing that the people come and hear from what the government or the policymaker want to do. We switch from that. We ask them instead, I mean the policymaker, they need to come to hear the people. So we organize the forum by design the role of the people to be there to speak and the policymaker to be there to listen and thinking about how to address hope and fear of the people. And that is something that very important. We use the empathy maps, which is the way that we put the persona there in the table, and we ask participants, mostly 100 people join the session, and we ask them to experience, to perceive that, to imagine if they were those people, how they feel, to understand how struggle those people are, especially the weak in the society there. As I already gave some example, which is the homeless person. Okay, and then of course, we move the process with the narrative. We move from fearful to hopeful and wishful. Wishful is mean that you need to thinking about how to build up hope to cope with fear. And with this jigsaw, we call the activity as the policy markets. The markets create the sense that this is not only the term, actually is the metaphor that ask people to feel that they walk into the market, which everyone need to be imagine that in the market, you know, you equal to each other. I mean, no one care the position that you have. So in the policy market, everyone has the right to get the good idea. This is the principle. You don't need to thinking about the thing that has feasibility to do. Just provide the policy idea that you have to build up hope to cope with fear of the people. So we move from fearful, hopeful to wishful. And then we use the future triangle in the sense that when you're thinking about future orientation policy analysis, it means a lot because it moves away from the feeling that it's too difficulty, too possibility. It's possibility, but it might need time. So it doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just needs more time than others. So that's why we try to use future-oriented policy analysis, introduce people to thinking about long-term. Something is not really impossible, but in fact, it just needs time. That is the main point. And in the end, we move from fearful, hopeful, wishful to willful. In this process, we ask them to backcasting what we need to do to build up hope to cope with fear of the people. I mean, the common hope and the common fear on the one hand, and hope and fear of the disadvantaged people on the other hand. What we should do, and backcasting. And we're gonna see what can we do now, and then what is the future plan for us to do this for sustainable change, for the possibility to transform. And the end of the process, if you look at the policy process in general, they usually end up with feasibility study, for example, to do environmental impact assessment, health impact assessment, economic impact assessment, social return on investment, or something like that. We introduce the new tool to thinking about the feasibility, which is called emotional impact assessment. We perceive that actually emotion is grabbed different criteria to determine style public policy. And with that, we use emotion to grab what policy does it sound or not, is related on the feeling that you have on it. So we ask people to make adjustment to legitimize the policy by put the sticker, the card into the project for them to be able to see that this is the hopeful one, this is the valuable one, this is a complex one, this is a relevant one. And that time I need to recognize that it is in the time of the COVID-19 as well. And with that, people come with masks. And when we create the card with different faces, show different feelings, different emotional expression, this is a very good time, you know, people with masks, they can express their feeling. It's powerful in that moment. I mean, with people struggle very much about the COVID-19. So this is the end of the process. But then we not only make the dream for the people, we not end up with just only the policy proposal. We end up with the very concrete action with lovely $35,000 US from the government to organization, which is Thailand Policy Lab on the one hand, and Chiang Mai City Lab on the other hand. The donor from the National Economic and Social Development Board and National Innovation Agency, public organization in Thailand, support the budget. So we make change. For example, we install the vending machine that provide the alcohol gel, mask, of course, pills, and still water for the homeless. We also have a very interesting space that we call the safe space for the people who has the mental problem, for them to be able to use this space to express their frustration of the situation. I'm gonna go back to the homeless one. It's very important that the municipality agree to use the vacant land of the city, lovely 70 acres, to transform the land to be the urban farming area. And I think it's very interesting that we can incorporate the homeless people to use that piece of land for them to be able to generate income on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's going to be the food bank. This is on the process of the development. We call this as the space of possibility because it can create many possibilities for disadvantaged people in our society. There will be the announcement of something after this session, so I could not say much, but what I can say is there will be a reason for you to be able to visit the site in 2025. I'm gonna end my presentation with the challenges. I have too much challenges. I'm gonna pick just only one thing. I think it's very important to point this out. Sometimes I also ask myself to make a critical reflection. I think it's true that for some people, this process can be just the feel-good politics for them. So what we need to do, what we need to make sure, what we need to secure the process, this and keep going the process is that to make the actual change, to make the actual transformation for those people who engage into the process from the beginning. We should not just end with the policy proposal. We need to end with action, the action that build up hope to cope with fear. Thank you.
Okay, those are four very, very interesting presentations coming at the question from different angles. And I think if I've learned one thing, I should have probably phrased this as a panel on both inclusion and exclusion. That probably would have been a better way to frame it. So we're going to take some questions now from the audience and online. We have a roving microphone here. So we can just go to hands, yeah. We'll start over on this side of the room and then move across.
Well, thank you for that inspiring kick in the butt. You know, sitting here, it made me think. I was driving yesterday back to my place, and I drove by several homeless shelters. And I saw these people sitting there, and you've probably seen them too, right? They're out there sitting. You know, what would really be dramatic is if we had a bottom-up panel of people who are homeless or indigenous or the people we're talking about, whoever it is, whatever group it is, there to talk to us about what they're experiencing, the failures that they see in us in not being able to deliver for them. And then on top of that, for them to actually have a workshop, to actually sit down with us, the top-down people, the scholars, and instruct us on what they think about the world that they live in. Because then we connect. And I think this presentation from Thailand really touches on that. I really appreciate the way you're framing this, and I look forward to more of that. But I think all of us could learn from these other people. You know, we're book smart, we're intellectuals, but there's people who are trying to carve out just the survival of today. I think we need to be a little bit more introspective, and they could help us to be there. Thank you.
Could you also introduce yourself when you pose a question?
Oh,
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, I didn't ask you.
I'm not trying to grab any attention here other than just make a point. But the question was to the last presenter that apparently you're having success with this, and you know, what are you going to do to sustain that? But I'm Dr. Ziggy Kazicki from the University of Detroit, and I'm here having a panel on COVID, economic impact, et cetera. Thank you.
Pia Pong, did you want to reply to that, or?
Yes, I think the thing that we can do maybe not to transform their life or change the whole system for them, but at least we can provide choice. And I accept that some homeless, they have very difficulty and their life very complex with the situation that they are facing in everyday life, and they not really want to engage. That is not the thing that we can do. We create the space, the inclusive space. We never exclude them. We want them to come. We empower them. But that's only the choice for them. In the end of the day, their life is their own life. They have the self-determine, they need to self-determine their own life. And actually, as a very small people like us, we just do what we can do. And we believe that we can pave the way towards something meaningful.
Thank you. Did anybody else on the panel want to comment on this? Okay, take another question.
Sorry, Ali Hamoudi, PhD at UCD, University College Dublin. My question is general, but one of the critiques of the concept of social exclusion is the idea that there's a marginalized group of people or a set of groups of people who are marginalized. And what happens is instead of focusing on the process of marginalization, the process of disadvantage, the process that leads to disadvantage, we focus on these specific groups as though they are the targets and the issue. And when just listening to this conversation, I do hear a lot of us and them. And I wonder your responses to that.
Any of you would like to go?
I'm trying to think of what to.
So I think it's a very good point. From a data perspective, there is no us and them. So for me, that difference doesn't exist because every one of us could be under or overrepresented in the data and we might not know the way we engage. Which is an issue because you might not know that you're part of the marginalized group until you know. So I think, in that sense, there is no divide, but I think the thing is we think there is a divide. And from my field, there isn't. Thanks.
I'm just going to add to that because the idea of representative bureaucracy came up, but I think, from a public policy perspective, from the standpoint of the study of public policy, we also need to talk about representation in the research field. And I think when you have greater representation in universities, greater representation of who's involved in doing research, you may get different kinds of research. And when I was speaking about community engaged research, I mean, oftentimes the people that are kind of on the ground doing that may come from the communities that they're looking at, and that kind of connection and also the knowledges that come from communities, including the houselessness that you were observing in Toronto, and we can point to other cities, is important knowledge, and it changes. I think yesterday when we were having the discussion, the keynote yesterday was highlighting the idea of science and democracy. And if we're kind of talking about democratizing the process, democratizing ways people are represented, then it means the science in some ways changes too, because you have more knowledges that you're dealing with. You're dealing with knowledges in the plural. So I think that is, to my mind, a part of the kind of methods that would be used in this inclusive state agenda that is trying to overcome the contradiction of exclusion.
Yeah, I would just add to that at the University of Toronto, people have been thinking hard about community engagement in research. And we've been developing an action plan here, recognizing, of course, that, a lot of good research, much good research does require, a collaborative relationship with members of the community. And so we've developed a compensation package. We've besides develop for their time, for their labor, for their willingness to participate. And we've also been thinking really hard about, what does that look like when you have community partners and you are engaging them in your research, and, principles around reciprocity, transparency, accountability. These principles are being articulated. Now, that is in addition to the important point that Yasmine is making about, the nature of the academy itself in terms of its own representativeness as a body of scholars. But these are things that are clearly, the universities are thinking about these things. The University of Toronto will not be alone in this, but actually then implementing them can be a very different exercise. Are there any other questions?
Hello, my name is Kevin Zapata from the University of Nottingham. First of all, thank you so much for the presentations. They were very enlightening. My question, one of the points that was presented, it was about the tensions between inclusivity, plurality, the governance, and actually making things happen. And in that sense, I just wonder, if there's a point where it's too much inclusivity, it's too much governance, and because I do remember one case, and I think it's from the JFK Harvard School of Governance, like George Bush during the Katrina hurricane tried to create this committee that brought so many stakeholders, and at the end, nothing happened. So right now, I think that in the literature, we bring so much about governance, and we are kind of naive thinking that all the actors involved are benevolent and everyone really wants to participate. But I think that it seems that sometimes could be too much. So I don't know how we can balance that.
I think that's a great question, and it's a hard question to answer because I start with the view that collaboration is really hard, and it's hard to make it work effectively. It's often something we fail into, and we fail into it after other strategies, which seem easier, have not worked. So I think your other point about the tension, I mean, that's the point I made, that there's a tension between our aspirations to use collaborative governance or other techniques or public participation for a kind of a democratic purpose, and then the aspiration to use it more for problem solving. So I don't think that this can be kind of settled in any way. Like there's no rule that can answer your question about what the right balance is. But I think it's always important to start with the idea that collaborative governance is hard to do well. And that can save you a little bit from over-optimism. And I think sometimes the over-optimism comes because we load all our aspirations on things like collaboration, and then we're disappointed when they don't work. But I think it's important to have a kind of a modicum, at least, of cautiousness about when we apply those ideas. So that, I guess that would be how I would answer.
Just to add one thing. So I work with climate change action communities, basically. And then you have very active people who have the time and resources to be part of the conversation. And then the hope is, at least the model we're trying to do, is that there's spillover effects for those who don't have the time and resources. So if you have a neighborhood and there's people who say, let's make the neighborhood more green, let's have this and that they will benefit from those people who have the time and resources to engage. So we're hoping for some of these spillover effects. It's not ideal, but it's sort of one way to think about it.
Thank you. Question here, I think, right? Have you got a mic?
I have a mic in my purse, actually.
Okay.
So my name is Patricia Hania. I'm a legal scholar here at TMU. And my question's directed at Yasmine directly because you're working in an area that I don't work in. And so I'm really looking at this language around inclusive state that you're speaking to. And I'm thinking of it in the context of refugees, conflict refugees. And what does that mean then is it really inclusive or is it selective, which I think you were hinting at? And I asked that question in the context of what we've seen most recently with Afghani, the state, and Ukraine, and what does that mean within our government? And in closing, I want to say thank you very much for raising the colonial state and in the violence in regards to Indigenous women and murdered and missing Indigenous women. So thank you for raising that point.
Okay, well, thanks for the question. So let me make the observation in a world of real states, and you start doing comparative work, a lot of things about Canada's policy around immigration and refugees is very good, right? And I say that because there's a lot of things other governments might be doing that might be benefited from looking at some of the things that Canada does. However, part of, I think, what the job is of policy, and even if you're thinking about the inclusive state, is sort of thinking about, could it be better? Like, is there a way, kind of being more normative about it and thinking about an ideal. And I would say on, refugee policy, like we're living through the contradictions right now. So on the one hand, Canada says they want immigrants and refugees. They have a policy that where they kind of follow what the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees says that they should have. But at the same time, it was Canada that pushed for the safe third country agreement between Canada and the United States, which is really interesting. It was not like the US telling Canada what to do, which is sometimes how it's framed. I mean, that was coming from the Canadian side many years ago, because they saw it as being a way to sort of limit the claims made on Canada and by refugees at the border. So what it's telling you is Canada wants to pick who the refugees are. They don't want people showing up at the borders. And a lot of times, even the most inclusive government, one of the most vibrant prime ministers that, was like out at airports embracing Syrian refugees and all this stuff, is at the same time sounding a little bit like Trump when they talk about, we don't want people showing up at the border. If you show up, you're going to be sent back. And you saw the extension just a few weeks ago of the Safe Third Country Agreement when President Biden was visiting here, with all kinds of consequences for many refugee advocates in terms of how many consequences that refugee advocates see for the safety and security of folks that may be in desperate situations. So on the Afghan and Ukrainian refugees, again, we're seeing this kind of variability in response, but I would say like what Canada's done with Ukrainian refugees, which was to institute a policy of saying, hey, we have no limits on numbers, people can come at least temporarily, we'll sort of see what happens. That's like creative. And that was a good thing. It just needs to be applied to more people than it has been. So those are some of the observations I'd make on that. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. So Mia, do we have some online questions for the panelists?
Yeah, we actually had quite a few online questions. So I sort of tried to group it by theme. So I'll give you some larger questions and maybe more specific ones. So a larger theme, how does inclusion in the decision-making space look like? And maybe even specifically using the example, meet people where they sit. So what are some of the processes that you're considering to ensure that data gets used in a practical way? Another question was, what approaches can we use to expose power structures that uphold the attributes of settler colonies? And since the inclusive state doesn't recognize the demands for Indigenous autonomy, should we start to modify the concept, or should we start to look at other ideas? And again, a larger sort of question, does the concept of inclusion, can we even consider that possibly a political myth? that's used to tame and hide exclusion, which has always been present.
So the first question is it says, what does inclusion in the decision-making space look like? And I think it was a question specifically to you, Sarah, about in terms of processes to use the data in a more inclusive way. So I understand the question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the question, even though thank you, Mia, for reading it. So I think I talked a lot about how decision-making translates the data back to the citizen, but obviously it also goes the other way around. So in this participatory models, how do we translate this information, also those emotions and feelings back to the policymaker? And I think the other way around, which is why I didn't talk about, is a lot more difficult. So there's movements currently where people say we want to create our own data that we then feed into government because it's the language that they understand. Because the emotional side of thing is very difficult to translate and sort of have an average or a direction. So then I come to this point that I actually want to make is there's two languages being spoken sometimes, and it's really hard to find common language. So if government is looking for data and indicators and someone tells a story, how do you translate that into something that government can use to make policy? So I think we have to find sort of a common language to achieve that. Thank you.
Did anybody else want to comment on this question more generically? No.
I'm not sure.
Not
I can't quite think of a great answer.
Okay, so then we'll go to the
Think about
second
it,
question, which I think is directed to you, Yasmine, around the approaches that can be used to expose colonial practices, as I understand it, and how we can.
Yeah, I just want to be sure I understand that question.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the question, would you mind to repeat it?
Yeah, sure. So what are the approaches we can use to expose the power structures that uphold the attributes of settler colonialism? And also within that, since the inclusive state does not recognize the demands for autonomy for indigenous governance and in other ways, should we modify then this concept that we have of the inclusive state or move to a different conceptual framework?
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I mean, I think, okay. First off, what processes can be used to illuminate the settler state? I think the processes that illuminate it are talking about it and theorizing about it and understanding that there's a body of literature that is out there that is doing that. And this is a growing body of literature. And it's particularly, I think people are getting a sense of it. It's particularly important in the Canadian context in this moment because of this process of reconciliation and changes that we've been going through in this particular part of the world. But it is relevant actually to a number of states. And so I think it kind of theoretically raises this issue of different state forms that would be good to be thinking about when we're talking about public policy, because some of the issues at hand, look different depending on which state that you're talking about, right? But if you're talking about some kind of idea of inclusion, we'll leave aside the exclusion for a moment, but some kind of idea of inclusion and having more voices at the table and so on. It's in settler colonial context, it's very, very important to be thinking about Indigenous peoples. And I would say it also has implications on the policy side. So something like immigration starts to maybe look a little bit different when you actually think about including voices of Indigenous people and some of their experiences. I'll give you one example that there was an Indigenous community that made somebody who was claiming refugee status in Canada a member of their group. And they said, because this person's a member of our group, she shouldn't be deported. It was a nun from Nigeria. And the Canadian government said, oh, this is our right to do this. We're going to deport them. We don't see them as this person. We don't see them as a refugee. So it raises some really interesting questions about who gets to decide whose sovereignty and membership criteria are relevant. And then directly on the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's issues around even thinking about, this has been changed, the oath to citizenship. That was one of the calls. Change the oath to citizenship in Canada. It shouldn't just be to the Queen. We should recognize treaties, and that oath has been changed, but there's still more that could be done. For example, if Indigenous people are brought more into the process of settlement, how does that look different? How do immigrants maybe think differently, not act as the worst stereotype of a settler? If in the process of coming to Canada, they meet and work with and get to know Indigenous people, or if Indigenous people are directly involved in settlement services, which they traditionally haven't been, right? So I think there's all kinds of interesting things that could come up there. And as for modifying demands, I mean, I think the point of the inclusive state is that it's about civil society. Like, it's not about us saying what the demands should be, or like, it's really about listening to those that maybe haven't been heard from.
Could I maybe, I don't know if I'll address that precise question, but I just wanted to throw this out, that I'm sort of reflecting on this notion that the inclusive state could hide things that might be exclusive. And that's kind of an interesting idea, but it reminds me of a discussion that we've had for a long time in collaborative governance about the role of conflict, and kind of a long claim, I think, in the deliberative policy space is, I think it was Chantal Mouffe made this claim that, the claim that we should all get along and cooperate can actually be sort of repressive in a way. And I think maybe the inclusive state, that's one caveat that you could kind of, if the inclusive state means that we all are kind of sharing everything under the same banner, and that we're all feeling good about everybody being included, that could have the same kind of consequences. So I'm just reflecting on whether the inclusive state has those kind of meanings. On the other hand, I think, you can almost find problems with if we invented another concept, we would find that it had the same types of dynamics, that it produces the same kind of issues about inclusion. So I'm kind of the opinion that, what matters is how you use the concept, and then people should call you out if you are using it in an exclusive way. But so that's my reflection on that broader point.
Pia Pong, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I just feel it. I just think that it is a very good imagination. I mean, inclusiveness is the discord that can open the space for thinking about possibility, change, transformation. I mean, it's the imagination that helps us to move a little bit further to make things happen. But of course, if we look at the structure, the barrier of the system is not sufficient, of course, in neoliberal society like this, to thinking about just only inclusive state. We also need to thinking about inclusive market, of course. And I mean, it's a long way to go, but at least it is a very productive discourse. It helps us to imagine the better society, even in the small scale, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Aspirational. Yeah. Are there any questions from anyone in the room? Okay, did you have any more online, Mia?
I've got another question. Is collecting data on race, can it be a tool for inclusion, or can it actually cause harm, given the way that classification tends to work?
Let's take one at a time this time, since thanks for that.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question that a lot of statistical offices struggle with. So there's experiments with taking race out of the data, and then it showed back up in terms of where people lived. So then it just showed back up in the data in a different way. There's also this idea that if you sort of have less data on sort of the the characteristics of a person, that would make the data better for some reason, but actually the opposite is true. So if you don't have the granular data, you actually don't know all the information. And I know then the privacy people raise their hand, they're like, excuse me, but then you violate privacy rules. You don't if you collect the data in a certain way, and there's all kinds of discussions that I don't want to get into, but excluding certain features, and then it depends how you measure them, is actually an issue because they show up in other ways and you don't realize actually. But it's a very good question.
I'm just going to reflect on a kind of interesting debate that came out in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and maybe tells you a little bit of some differences about about Canada and the US. But in the US, there were some scholars that were saying, you know, there's a danger to doing a lot of race-based analysis of the COVID-19 pandemic because it starts to, a lot of the history of disease, and you can think about HIV/AIDS here, and the learning that took place from that kind of starts to make it look like it's only certain groups that are getting this disease, and then you kind of don't have the broader public health impact. In the context of Canada, which has had a kind of not great history of data collection, and a lot of things that have been critiqued about data collection, analysts were pointing to the idea that, you know, we don't even have like race-based statistics on what's happening with COVID-19. And this really goes back to a kind of history of, you know, kind of, of terminology around race, where the Canadian government came up with this term visible minority, which they used to mean anybody who is, quote, non-white and not Indigenous, and then giving information that was kind of all amalgamated and that you didn't know which group was being talked about. And so I think in the Canadian context, the issue has really been about disaggregating data, which is to say having more specific information on specific groups, and actually having it take place, actually having data collection take place. And I think that in the context of Canada, the COVID-19 pandemic really revealed the need to be doing that in the health sphere, and the difficulties in the country in doing that, because provinces were doing different things, and it was just complicated to actually know what was going on. So I think that I'm just going to say in general, these issues are really specific to the polity in question, because we know historically race-based data, you can take Nazi Germany as an example, has been used in genocidal ways, right? And that's always kind of the fear, but it can also, the collection of statistics can be used in ways that are for social good as well. So it's complicated, and I wouldn't make a blanket statement about that question ever, but just wanted to say a little bit about Canada.
Any further comments? Okay. I think Philippe is looking at me like it's time to pull this to a close. And I just want to say thank you so much to our 4 panelists today. I think you've done a super job of identifying the sort of the structural, the institutional, the ideational, the organizational, all of the factors that are really, kind of impediments to inclusive state. And I really appreciated the case studies that you've used to illuminate, how we could be doing things better when it comes to inclusion. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you, Grace, for the organization. So I have 3 important information to give you. So the first one is there is no coffee break now, because we have a closing drink. The second one is I want to welcome Oliver, because as you know, it's not a secret, we go next year in Guadalajara in Mexico for organize the new edition of the International Workshop on Public Policy. So I would like you say a few words about Guadalajara and push people to join us.
Thank you very much, Philippe, and thank you all, panelists as well. Thank you. I personally like very much the workshops. These are great opportunities to have a very interesting debate and also to expose ourselves to new ideas and new insightful ideas as well. Now, imagine doing this in a place where we can also enjoy good food, good weather, and amazing landscapes. So in the name of my colleagues back in Guadalajara and Mexico, who have been working very hard to make this possible, it is a great honor for me to welcome you to the next International Workshops in Public Policy to Guadalajara 2024. So thank you very much.
And now I have a secret to tell you, but I can tell you before the secret of the secret. You know, if you want that everyone speak about something, you begin to say that it's a secret. So Tuesday I say there is a secret, and suddenly I create two categories, inclusive and exclusive. People who know where is it and people who don't know. But I don't know why in 2 days, everyone I find the solution of the secret. But in any case, I would like to welcome and host our future host for ICP7 who take place in Chiang Mai in Thailand. Ora.
I think Philippe now realizes it's hard to keep a secret. So I just want to say that, this conference this year in Toronto has been very memorable, and all memories come with emotions, right? From perhaps a little frustrated. This is my own view of jet lag, and it's like, where's the rooms? Where's coffee? Where's the washrooms? But above the frustrations and everything, I think the joy and the excitement is what I experienced the most. The joy of seeing old colleagues, seeing former PhD students who are now blossoming academics, meeting new friends, making new connections, not just human-wise, because this is my first in-person conference in a very long time since the pandemic, but also connection in terms of our knowledge production, whether looking at old things, new ways, or even talking to some people at outside of the formal presentations, but it was like a master class for me because the ideas just really made me feel wow, So all those great emotions together, plus good food as well, good weather too. Imagine beautiful mountains and beautiful culture and temples, as well as modern amenities. That will be in Chiang Mai in 2025. It's a 1-hour flight from Bangkok in the north of Thailand. So I welcome all of you to come join ICPP 7 in 2 years from now. And we sure will be making many more memories out of great emotions together. So thank you, Philippe, and the team for trusting us to host.
Thank you very much. So after the two presentations, you understand that good food and good landscape is very important for the choice of new place. So thank you for all of you. We have a last multi-session in 15 minutes, and we can meet all each other for the closing drink, which take place just in front of outside. We have the sun. So see you later.